That's not what
As long as we take care of them.
we're taking care of that one.
Okay. Okay, so we'll call the work session to the City Commission to order for Wednesday, September 18th, 2019. Call the roll, please.
Commissioner Rachel Lyle-Smith.
Aye.
Commissioner, Commissioner Frank O'Donnell.
I'm here.
Commissioner Rocky Smith. Commissioner Denise McGriff. And Mayor Dan Holliday.
Here. So we have two discussion items. First one, 19-515, homeless presentation, Chief Band.
Good evening, Mayor and Commission. If you remember, at the budget hearings and then at your goal session, homelessness was you had a lot of questions. And so that has been on our list to just give a presentation to you. I'm going to give some caveats because I'm not a homeless expert. I am somebody who's worked as a police officer in varying positions for 20 years in this community. And I know how this community's changed, and I know how homelessness has changed in this community. If you go ask people in our community, if you talk to somebody from one of the churches that volunteer to help homeless, somebody who works at Father's Heart, you said, hey, tell me about the homeless problem in Oregon City, they would talk about people who needed help, people with mental health issues, drug issues, financial issues, for whatever reason, homeless people who needed help. If you maybe talk to somebody who lived on the promenade or somebody who had a downtown business or other people in the community and said, hey, tell me about the homeless problem in Oregon City, they'd say, well, somebody stole my kid's bike, I found somebody in my garage, somebody defecated on our back porch, and both groups are right. Homeless people need help, but there is a ripple effect that any community helping homeless people is going to feel. Anything that I say, I do not have an intent of indicting homeless people or Father's Heart, because that will come up in the conversation. I just want to share information and more information from the aspect of the majority of the complaints about homelessness come to the police department. It's a livability issue, and livability issues live with us. And people tend to think that we can somehow arrest or cite our way out of the homeless problem, and that's just not really the case. So I've got some information to share with you. Phil's going to talk a little bit about some of the impact to the parks. I've got a couple slides from Mo. Mike Day is here with us. So let me share some information. Do I have this?
Yep.
Look at that. Okay, so I talked about this briefly. There's a point in time homeless count that is done by volunteers every 2 years. It is not a scientific study. They basically go, I think they go to 62 sites, go to the same sites, and it's not scientific. It's the only number that I see, though. This year troubled me a little bit. Because if you look at these numbers citywide, the top 4 cities that you see on the chart, their numbers are so low, they're not really significant. I've been looking at crime stats for a long time. I've never seen any stat, this is not a criminal stat, but I've never seen stats where we outdo the county. And if you add the city of Clackamas, unincorporated, and Wilsonville, which are all serviced by the sheriff's office, we beat all of them put together. You can see those cities went down substantially in this count, Milwaukee, Molalla, and Clackamas, and we went up by 50%, and that's fairly troubling in 2 years. I think the moral of my story is homeless people need to be helped. What is the capacity of this city to do more? Are we doing our part? I think we are. I think the community has really done a good job of being tolerant. People who don't necessarily want homeless to be helped here. I think businesses have been really respectful. But ultimately, my question about homelessness is when are we doing enough? And I think ultimately there needs to be more of a regional approach to this across the county. There's 2 sets of stats I'm going to show you here. One is 2018, the whole year, and then one is the first half of 2019. These first 2 are going to be crime reports, and the second 2 I'm going to show you are arrests. Significant difference. If you look on this map, you can see kind of at the top, that's basically sort of the Main Street corridor up by the cove there. And then you can see up and down Molalla, sort of a concentration maybe by Fred Meyer, people who live, honestly, down in Newell Canyon. There's a lot of homeless folks in Newell Canyon. What's that?
Did we not get that cleaned up in the last couple weeks?
Pieces, but there's, I will get to that.
Okay.
I've got some pictures. So over time, we started thinking, okay, Father's Heart comes to town. There's a huge influx. There's a big public outcry. Let's arrest our way out of this problem. It just does not work. When I say homeless person, I have met young women who are homeless, living alone. I've spoken to guys with mental illness, people with drug addiction. So to say homeless person is really not fair to any of them, because it is such a diverse group who has such different needs. But generally, if you're dealing if our officers are getting called to deal with somebody who has some kind of an issue, what we found is if we charge them with a crime, they generally don't really show up for court. They get arrested numerous times. If we take them into custody, we have to seize their belongings. The jail will not accept them, and that's not always an easy thing to do. There's just a lot of dirty stuff, and I'll talk about a little bit more of that later. So you kind of have to really want to get arrested if you're a homeless person in this town, because it just doesn't really solve problems. And if people ever finally leave, that warrant will pop up because they didn't go to court and maybe they've moved on to Multnomah County. They talk to the police and they come back to our jail because they have a warrant. Here you can see that the crimes, and this was 2018, criminal trespass, which is basically being on somebody else's property. We give lots and lots and lots of warnings for trespass. You can't be camped here, that sort of stuff. Methamphetamine shows up as a drug more often than anything else. Drinking in public, if you look at, and this is pretty true across other cities, alcohol actually leads to more behavioral calls than narcotics do. I think heroin addicts tend to keep to themselves more than anything else. Methamphetamine, not so much so, but alcohol really leads to a lot of calls. And again, drinking in public places, to get arrested for that, you really want to go to jail. And I'm sure some of those are, we go to detox downtown. We take people to detox a lot more than we used to. And then there's serious offenses. We're in the middle of a trial right now for a homicide that took place in 2018. Homeless on homeless. We've learned a lot about the inside of homelessness there. It's a very dangerous place to be if you're a woman. Rape one, robbery. 2019, this is just the first 6 months. You can see, I think the last one was 8% of the crimes, this is 7. Locations are basically the same, and the crimes are basically the same. Again, different year, rape 1, domestic violence, strangulation, which is really scary. So now, these are arrests, and a lot more arrests than crimes. So if you look, about a third of the arrests that we made in 2018 were homeless people. That's a lot. Locations, Oregon City Shopping Center, the Transit Center. You can see the police departments there, and that would basically be people who show up for court and end up going to jail. The hospital has a pretty significant impact. And then Father's Heart's actually on this list for 2018. And you can see where they're located, lots downtown, and then a lot around that Molalla, Beaver Creek area. We got a complaint one time, I think the mayor was on this, and Tony too, a guy had complained that there were 30-some shopping carts on Beaver Creek Road between Molalla and 213, and I thought, that's not true, 30-some shopping carts. I went and counted, there weren't 33, there were 38. I couldn't believe it, and it is people going down to their different access points down on that metro property that's Newell Canyon. The arrests, you can see 244 of them are just arrest warrants. One interesting stat, 25% of them have more than one arrest. One guy was arrested 11 times for warrants in 2018. Trespass, again, parole violation, mental hold, that's not really an arrest, but we are taking somebody into custody. You know, I still wish there was something to do with, you know, people who have mental illness. We do the same thing to them as somebody who's committing a crime. We throw handcuffs on them and put them in the back of a car. And it's criminalizing mental health because there's really no other option. We take people into mental holds when they have to be ready to hurt themselves or somebody else right now. Not threatening that I'll do it at some point, but those are very, very real situations where somebody's in crisis. A lot of times suicidal as well. 2019. Basically the same. You can see the concentration where these arrests are taking place. The percentage is a little bit less, but it's still close to a third, between a third and a quarter. One guy 10 times arrested in the same period of time, and you can see the locations there. So I'm not crazy about this stat because I don't have 17 and 18 on there, and the reason is we switched our computer-aided dispatch software. You would think with technology you would have a better ability to search, and you don't. I tried to get 17 and 18, and there's no way to get an apples to apples. But what you can see here, Father's Heart came to us in the end of 2012, and you can see it pretty significant. These are calls of service, calls for service that involve homeless folks, and you could see the increase. I'm not disparaging Father's Heart. They do a great job taking care of homeless folks. But when you do that, you're going to bring more homeless people here, and that's very clear. What you see there. We did have homeless people here before Father's Heart. We could name most of them, and we knew where they were. It changed significantly during that time. I have had people say to me, well, they're here because of services. There's a lot of county services here. Those services have been here the 20 years I've been here, and we didn't have that problem then. Homeless camps. You see the same change in numbers here, 2012 to 13. And you can see the numbers just increasing. And this year, I'm fairly confident we're going to be over 100. These camps, I asked Nancy Bush, our code enforcement manager, what is your average staff time on a camp? And she estimates about 4 is the average. Some are fairly quick, and then some are really serious.
4 man hours? Or
yes, 4 hours.
Okay.
Yeah. So this, a couple things. We do have some other pictures here, but you can see some of these structures. This structure's down in Newell Canyon, and I'm fairly confident, where's Mike at, that we asked Metro to expedite this, and I think they were working on it. There was another one that they cleaned up the week before this. And I mean, they're taking their mule down there and hauling bags and bags of stuff out. And this thing's been here for a long time. There's a shower, there's a bathroom that we spared you the pictures of.
That looks like a camp from The Walking Dead.
The reason I put the pod in here is we've had that pod for 2 years, 3 years.
We lost all our video.
Or what?
Oh, all of our, there we go.
So, some homeless folks, you know, they've got food or they've got whatever. We can't dig into their stuff. If they get taken into custody, or if you find somebody's stuff that to you and I may look like, oh, that's garbage. Well, maybe it's important to somebody. So there's pretty strict rules we have to follow about property. And we were keeping some of this stuff in our basement, and that became problematic very fast.
I imagine.
So we just rent this pod and have for a long time, and that's where we store that stuff. Warming shelters. This I'm putting in there just because this is a capacity issue for me. And when the county was here talking about this, I think they'd mentioned that we were Oregon City provided 44% of the shelters, warming shelters for last year. Our population is about 10% of the county, this city. And so when I see we're doing almost half the shelters for the entire county, is it time for somebody else to step up? I think it is. We're doing our part, and what is the capacity of this city to be doing this? You see the same thing, 16, 17. The middle year is kind of an anomaly. The county had rented, I think it was 138 beds in Southeast Portland. They were expecting a pretty tough winter. And so our percentage was lower then, but that year was kind of an anomaly just because they had rented more beds.
Go back to the encampment.
Yeah.
So one of the things that has not been put in statistics is what is the cost, well, you don't know this, but there's a cost to the degradation of the land and what's going on in terms of erosion or removal of plant materials or just the whole, I mean, that whole landscape area down there being completely denuded or whatever. And so that belongs to the public. Mm-hmm. That property down there belongs to the public, even though Metro is managing it or not managing, whatever you want to say. So there's a cost there that's not accounted for.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Well, if we look in the bottom right, left corner of that picture, you see some firewood there. I'm guessing they don't go buy their firewood by the cord.
I don't think so.
They're probably
Much more than that.
probably cutting down trees and cutting them up, right? So, and I heard from Metro staff that I think it's this one in the center. These guys even had solar panels set up so they had power.
Where'd they get those from?
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm going to call attention to something that's not widely known, but the mayor and I engaged Metro and other services because during the heat wave, we were concerned that cooking with fires and maybe having fires during the evening would result in a fire that, if anybody understands how currents move, air currents move, it would sweep up that fire, up that canyon. And we would have a conflagration. We would destroy buildings, lives, property.
because that extends all the way from, say, down Division Street, where just before the hospital, and all the way up to 213 and Beaver Creek Road. And you had a fire going down there, we could have taken out several apartment complexes, a few hundred houses. It'd be really tough to control once it got going.
Well, they wouldn't be able to get down there to fight it.
Right.
No. And I actually want to commend the mayor for his foresight, and I was glad we got involved in that. Because those currents sweep up a canyon, and the fire would sweep up with.
So Metro and Oregon City did go down and clean up a bunch of stuff, but I don't think the county doesn't really work well with Metro in the metro areas that are in unincorporated Clackamas County. We can enforce our stuff in metro property. It's inside our city limits. So we still need to have a discussion amongst the jurisdictions about, especially those areas that are actually in wildland, that we find a way to patrol them and make sure that we know what's going on there and get people out of there as soon as we can.
Mike, while I'm finishing, you want to come sit up here in case some questions come up later. Officer Day, it's the first time I've grown weary of hearing people say positive things about one of our officers. He's just done such a fantastic job. And the most self-directed good job I've ever seen. You know, all the things that we've done from Arta Potties to these grants, they're nothing that we found out about and pointed him in that direction. He just went and found them and came to come and said, hey, can I go get $75,000 in grants? Sure. And so this is some of his outreach. And I say this because I said some things that some people would construe as negative to homeless people, but we're really, Mike and our department has really been trying to help, to help and to learn. I think one of the most significant things I've learned listening to Mike is the successes come through case management, and they come from helping one person at a time, not helping everybody, because they're literally all individuals. Mike got 2 different grants, and they're run through the county. There's a lot of paperwork. to do, but there's accountability for the money that he's spending in the grants. And so some of the, basically what there will be is, say they're about to get kicked out and they've got back rent or something like that and penalties. Mike has gone in and paid those. They've got enough money to make their rent. They just can't pay these back fees. So people who have been almost homeless, he's been able to keep them in housing, or help people get the kind of paperwork or anything that they need to get Social Security that's due them. They just need a little bit help getting everything documented, a mailing address for them to get housing. And Mike's really got a bunch of really good stories. I'm not going to go through these. They're in here. Mike, why don't you pick one of these stories and just share it briefly about a success? And
Yeah, so the top one there, the B household, that's a family of 3. They were both homeless, living out of their 2 vehicles in the Rivercrest neighborhood. A beautiful neighborhood. They didn't cause any issues in that neighborhood, but they were brought to my attention. I went and met them, and I was floored by the fact that they were really put together. And not that homeless people aren't, but this family was really put together, and they were in this situation. They had income, son worked, they had back rental debt, a substantial amount for whatever reason, but that was the only thing keeping them from getting housed. So as soon as we addressed that with those grant funds, they moved into a place down off McLaughlin, Oak Grove area, and things have been great, and the amount of thanks received from them was phenomenal because they were so appreciative, because that debt was such a burden to them that they thought they could never get out of it.
so when there's other stories that are really interesting where Mike's gotten people into housing and then he sees them on the street a month or 2 later and they didn't want to be in housing. And I'm just saying that's how complex this issue is. Parks, we've got some slides, and Phil's going to run through some of the impacts to parks.
Thank you. So a lot of the impacts that Chief Band was speaking to, you see the homeless shelters or needing to shelter during the cold winter months, during the warm months, and during the times of year when they can be outside of the shelters. You see them in public areas. So we do see quite a bit of impact in our open spaces, our nature parks along the river's edge, some of the more impacted spaces along the Willamette River, John Storm Park, Clackamas Park, the Cove, and the Clackamas River Trailhead is where we see a lot of our impact areas. Some of the concerns we hear from staff and from the public, most of them center around either safety or the appearance of safety or sense of safety while participating in one of our parks or activities. And so they'll come to, as an example, this is at John Storm Park, they'll come to the park and they'll notice, a homeless encampment, people using the shelter. They'll move around to a different area. We've had members of the public that have complained about being harassed by homeless individuals. And again, I don't want to Chief Band's point, not all homeless people are exactly the same, and we have a lot of homeless people that are very considerate. But we do have individuals that are dealing with different issues, and we do have individuals that will approach general public members that are there to use the park for the intended purposes. Some of the examples that we've had in some of our parks, just heckling mom and a couple children in the park that have been reported. We've actually had to have staff go in and step in and make sure they get to a safe area. We had one member of our team out and blowing one of the parks, and it was evidently, in an area where a homeless individual was camped out, and they were upset about it, came and pushed the staff member from behind, had the heavy pack on his back, and he fell over. Luckily nothing happened further from there, but it is something that staff have to take into consideration when they're out and doing their daily work out in the parks. This is, again, and Jim has a lot of great statistics. Ours is mostly anecdotal photos. We did interviews with staff to try to get some of their stories that we're hopefully able to share. So you'll see some of the in quotes, those are from staff members speaking to how homelessness has impacted their day-to-day work in the parks. So what used to be maybe a half an hour picking up John Storm and Sportcraft is now over 2 hours on a typical event based on some of the homeless impacts. Old Kenema Park, a lot of the unwanted activities that staff deal with is, human waste in our park system. And so the Arta Potties are a great help, and I thank PD for getting those into the areas that we do have them, but we often have folks that go into areas less traveled, Old Kenema Park, Waterboard Park, Singer Creek Park, and they obviously need to use facilities, and they do that in the parks. And so staff do need to go in and pick up encampments from time to time, and that's part of the work that they're doing.
Yeah.
Another couple of photos, again, John Storm Park, the McLaughlin Promenade. Some of the other issues that we deal with in the parks is related to drug use, drug paraphernalia. So we have a lot of needles that we find in the park system. Sometimes they're brought to our attention by the public. A lot of the time staff are able to get in there before the public are in those areas in order to clean up before someone from the public finds it. Quote from one of our guys, homeless people bring bikes and shopping carts into the restrooms and need to wait for them to leave before I can clean up. Sometimes they won't come out and we need to call police to clear them out before I can do my job. So in order just to get into, they'll barricade the restroom area in order to use it as a shelter. And staff will sometimes come into those situations. I'll be able to ask them to leave, and they'll end up leaving. Other times, we will need to ask for assistance in order to get somebody out of the area so that we can go in and clean effectively. When those issues happen, sometimes we have, retaliatory behaviors that occur. So we'll have, things broken on purpose or damaged fecal material spread in areas where they know that they'll have to be cleaned up by park staff, and so it's a lot of their daily duties is to clean up those areas. This is a camp that was cleaned up. We have obviously the camp cleanups that PD helps to get cleared out, and then we have other areas. This was a camp that had moved on, and items that were left behind. I assisted staff in cleaning up this area. It took us about 2.5 hours for staff working to clean it up. Filled a 2-yarder full of garbage that had to be hauled out of the natural area, and so not easy to get equipment in there. It does take some additional labor and time. And to Denise's point, I'm sorry, Commissioner McGrath, the degradation of the properties as well. Some of the other issues that we deal with is people living in their cars. Most of the time, folks that are living in their cars tend to keep to themselves. You don't see as many issues as you may find in the natural areas in our park system, but you do still see impacts. So there'll be trash that'll pile up around the vehicles. Again, people need to be able to use some facilities, and you have issues with cleanup in those areas as well. I want to thank PD and Captain Klur worked very closely with us on an issue at the overflow parking lot just today, where we're clearing, we had 7 RVs and a couple of vehicles that were camping out in the overflow parking area, and we're getting that cleaned out. They've been noticed, and we're closing it tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. So working very closely with code enforcement, with PD. Officer Day has been a fantastic help for park staff, but we, again, deal with these very regularly.
So did that just happen overnight, or it happened over a session of days, or?
We had 2 RVs that were kind of on and off in the area, in the overflow parking area. Over the course of a couple of days, we had an additional 5 RVs that showed up, and then some additional cars as well. And so
we jumped on it today because it was
I saw
like
2 down there, and then
yeah,
there were 3.
yeah,
And there were 7.
There was a bunch, right, you have 2, you have 4, and then you have 8, and you have
I
16.
think the word gets out.
So we also deal with transient issues on our dock. So this is at John Storm Park. We have our boat dock, and there's a timing requirement for the amount of time they can be on the dock, and then they have to leave and they can come back. But we do have, this is a transient boat that we ended up having to work with the county sheriff's office in order to get moved on.
Do we have any ability to say if the boat is not actively registered that it is automatically disqualified from being tied up? I can't see the registration on that boat, but
It looks like.
Looks like 19.
Yeah.
so they can afford to buy the registration for the boat.
Cheaper than rent.
But you're tied up to a dock.
Yes.
Some of the challenges that we deal with, again, not specific to camping in a park, but transient use of different areas that we're responsible to maintain. This was a quote from one of our park admin staff that has worked for the city for a number of years and speaks kind of to the same point that Chief Band had spoken to. It has changed. So the day-to-day work that our parks crew deal with on a day in, day out basis, what they do today versus what they did, 6-7 years ago is considerably different. And so we have a loss of opportunities to do additional work, so fixing irrigation, trimming trees, taking care of planting beds. Those things don't happen because we have those additional impacts. And again, we do it and we want to maintain safe and clean facilities, and we just have to make those decisions day to day given our available resources.
So, just a couple slides, we're almost done. Mo gave me some stats on, there's a lot of folks, if you're ever at the library in the morning, there's people who will, it's a warm place, they can have access to the internet, place to hang out, they use the bathrooms, and Mo and her staff work pretty hard to be very accommodating. We have had some incidents, I think some that have really alarmed the library staff where police have gone down. There was a fight recently that took place down there. We did do a training this last year, citywide training staff. We had some mental health crisis workers from Clackamas County Behavioral Health Unit to come and teach the staff, here's how to recognize the signs of mental illness. And if you're dealing with somebody who's mental ill, here's some tips on how to talk to them, just to kind of empower our staff. We've also talked about things like if a homeless guy is on a bench sleeping, people will call the police and say, there's a homeless guy on the bench sleeping. Well, if my grandma was on the bench sleeping, you wouldn't say anything. So we don't kick a homeless guy off a bench for sleeping if we're not going to kick my grandma off the bench. So homeless people still have rights. And so we've really worked hard to educate the staff citywide about how to interact with homeless people, how to make sure that we're following the law. And you've seen in the news, the city of Portland's gotten into, they're trying to do the right thing, but as everybody's learned kind of how to deal with this issue, respecting the homeless people's rights. But you can see they have incidents with people who are not homeless, and they have a lot of incidents with homeless people, and there's a lot of homeless folks who come in there and don't cause any problems at the library.
I do know that there was a time last year, I think I was dropping by the library before a meeting or something, and I walked into the men's room on the ground floor, and there was this guy that was stark naked standing in front of the sink, and had a whole pile of his belongings by the door, and I'm not sure anybody wants to take their 5-year-old, 6-year-old boy into the men's room to find a totally naked guy there.
Yeah. The last couple odds and ends that I'm just going to mention, motorhomes, you saw that is becoming a thing, and it's basically because if we tow a car and nobody picks it up, the tow yard can go sell that for scrap. There's a process they go through, and they're not out money because essentially they can make a few $100 selling a car. You'll see Bud's Towing has cars for sale, and a lot of people, their kid's first car is a Bud's Towing car. Motorhomes, there's really nothing they can do with, and we now as a city, when we have to impound a motorhome, we have to pay, the city pays $86 a linear foot to dispose of a motorhome. And in Portland, you can see some of this stuff in the news too, where a tow company will have a motorhome, they can't get rid of it, so they'll sell it for 25 bucks to oftentimes somebody who's homeless. And so there have been tow companies that have left, at 2 a.m. left an abandoned motorhome somewhere that they didn't want in different cities. And so this is kind of something we're having to deal with is this homeless motorhome issue. We don't want to tow these things because it costs us money to impound them.
Have we thought about working with the Clackamas Fire District and use those motorhomes as training vehicles?
No, we haven't.
There's an idea. Because the reason most of the reason a motorhome isn't recyclable is because most of it's like wood.
And plastic.
And so in plastic, so you could burn that down and then you could recycle the frame of the motor.
That's an idea. A couple other things, just randomly. Arta potties cost the city about $750 a month. They get used a lot. I've asked Mike several times, looking at the budget, are these things getting used? And they get used a lot. So it's a great program. If they weren't going there, they'd be going somewhere else.
That's per unit, correct, Chief?
No, that's the total cost of all the units.
Okay, very good.
And are we still getting a break from the guy?
No.
Okay.
So what do we do about it? We're going to keep working and doing things and kind of finding smarter ways to do things. I think there are political conversations that need to take place to make this as a regional thing as possible. I've talked to the city of Milwaukee. A commissioner wanted to meet and talk about homelessness, and they were very open and wanted to know what their city could do to help. And I think that if all of the services weren't here, I think everybody would feel a little bit rather than this city is really feeling a lot. That's really all I have. If you have any questions of me or of Officer Day, let me know.
Commissioner Lass-Smith?
Thank you. Chief Ban, you had a slide on the warming shelters or temporary day shelters. And I'm asking because we're about to have a conversation on shelters, the warming shelters. So that, I just want to make sure I understand that 100 plus in Oregon City, are you saying, can you describe what that 100 plus
Yes.
actually means? Is that 100 different locations? Is that 100 times they were opened? I'm
Beds.
trying to understand your status.
That's a total number of beds. So the county every year puts out a request for qualifications, an RFQ for who can provide warming shelter services, and they will reimburse people for doing that. Father's Heart has done that every year, as have, I believe, some churches. And that year, I've taken these stats off. Vahid Brown with the county had sent us an email with some warming shelter information, and I think that's what he had in his email, was that over 100 of the beds that year came out of the 381 total for the county. Over 100 of them were Oregon City.
So 281 beds were offered in other areas of Clackamas County?
Yes, they had that's where they had contracted, I think 138 of them in Southeast that I don't think they ended up using.
So to your knowledge, do other jurisdictions in search of a bed during that time period, do they bring them to Oregon City? Or is that an unknown?
Beds, if someone's looking for a warmer steady bed, they can call 211 and learn where there's a bed available. If there's not one where they're at, they'll come to one where there is.
How do they get there?
There's various.
Crick?
Bus.
Yeah, I think arrangements can be made, or say one's at capacity, but there's an opening here, they'll get them there, either by bus or other means.
Anything else?
So is there anything controlling right now the number of beds that we are offering? Like, what is controlling that?
In the resolution that the city commission passes to allow the temporary warming shelters, there's a specific number of bed in each resolution that you approve. So each facility, you're approving the specific beds at that location.
So what we're talking about in the next thing is,
Yeah, it ties to
rather
that.
than doing that on a yearly basis, to figure that out.
Right.
Okay, well, the last thing I would say is, once again, Mike, you're doing yeoman's work out there, and certainly we appreciate everything that you have to say. And with that, we will move on.
Yeah, I think the value of this conversation is understanding that there is a cost to this community of Oregon City. And some of it's reported, some of it goes unreported. As I've run into thefts that have occurred at the Safeway, they choose not to report them. So we have to keep in mind the cost to this city. It's going to be a balancing act between compassion, but compassion for all, not only the homeless, but for our own citizens. So this is a good framework to start the next conversation we're about to have. Thank you, Chief.
Dan, why is Safeway not reporting them? That's what Frank was just saying. He said Safeway's
I
not
spoke
reporting.
to him. Somebody witnessed a theft up there where the homeless individual was stopped with a fake receipt. And they simply took back the merchandise, and they just feel there's no upside to reporting it.
Okay.
And I know the chief is, I don't want to berate the chief's department because they've had conversations as to what to do and what Safeway's responsibility is and how far they pursue it. But it's just a decision made by the individual company. They may not be the only one. So what I'm saying is, not only are there reported costs to this community, including Mike's position. I mean, those are costs we're incurring, and we have to be cognizant of that. But what I don't want is for the community to lose faith, and I don't want to be the next example of that documentary, Seattle is Dying. And I don't want our police department to lose. We need a combination of compassion and solutions. Well, understanding the difference in the homeless population.
And I think the clear evidence here is that we can't do this on our own. What we really need is for the state to give us back the ability to commit folks who are mentally ill so that they can be taken care of. And we need to enforce our narcotics laws. And once you get those people into the system, you give them a pathway to get off of heroin or methamphetamine or crack or whatever it is, and you follow that up afterwards with the support out in the community. I fully believe that, and if you watch the documentary, it plays it out, that almost everyone that is homeless and on the street has some substance abuse issue. I'm not saying all of them, but I would say a great majority of them do. And so until we as a state or as a region find some solutions that actually change the dynamic, and that means, if we don't want people to steal cars, and we had this problem for the last 4 years because the court decision about who qualifies as stealing a car. Guess what? Our stats in Oregon for car theft were through the roof. Now, they changed that in the 2019 legislature, and I think we're already seeing that car thefts are coming down. So this, while we have to do what we can, the solution to this is not at the city level. It's not at the metro level. It's definitely at the state level.
At a minimum.
Commissioner Shaw, we don't normally take testimony.
I realize that. I just
If you got something short, come up to the mic.
Okay. Thank you.
Brian Shaw, representing the Homeless Solutions Coalition, which used to be Oregon City Homeless Solutions Coalition, but now Clackamas County, which is good because it's starting to get regionalized, and we're now starting to get resources that's going to help us through here. Officer Day's on our committee, as is Chief Band and Phil Lewis. We started this committee probably 2 years ago, and when I got on it, I decided that, I want to accommodate these folks, but I don't want to encourage this. Now, unfortunately, people are finding about how we are being successful or whatever in this community and helping people. That's our end of this, trying to have the humanitarian part of this that you guys are talking about. And so this commission, this coalition, is really putting programs together to help these people that want out of this lifestyle. We're seeing all of the issues of the that minority of people that are probably causing all these problems. But I want you to know that this coalition is working hard, providing service malls for these people to come to get their ID or someplace to send their mail to, or to get them a job or a place to live, like Mr. Officer Day is doing here. So there's some good things going on here, and I know we've seen the rough side of this. And the Chief Band has done a great job, worked with us, and so we're trying. And you're right, it does need help. It's just that the county has been very useful with their resources and everything else, so thank you.
Thank you. With that, we're done with this conversation, and we're going to move on to 19-519, Code Amendments discussion, shelters. Ms. Turway.
Thank you very much. So with the code amendment process, we want to identify where shelters should be located within the city, if at all, and what the approval process should look like and what any standards should look like. So as you recall, the commission provided direction to staff. We had a couple of work sessions on it. At the last work session, there was a request to meet with some of the commissioners offline. We did that. There's a summary of that in your packet, and then Pete's going to walk you through a little bit more. What we're asking for tonight is some final direction on what to do with shelters, where they should be allowed, what the process of approval is, and if the criteria of approval is okay.
It's a very short presentation. In your packet, we talked about 4 definitions. Those are listed here. We would have one umbrella definition, which is shelters at the top. Definition for day shelters, definition for emergency shelters, which are those declared by the City Commission by resolution, and definition for temporary warming and cooling. And also has been suggested by the commissioners to entertain a possibility for a 5th definition in the code, which would be a transitional shelter definition, which would be intended to transition to permanent housing with a maximum residence time period, generally not to exceed 90 days continuously or 120 days in a calendar year. Understanding that all shelters, with the exception of emergency shelters, would go through a conditional use process. And in the zones that we have received direction on so far, which include the mixed-use downtown, except not within the design district, the mixed-use corridor district, high-density residential zones, and medium-density residential zones for up to 10 beds. It would be currently prohibited in all other zoning designations and subject to use-specific standards in the code. Those use-specific standards include requirements for a community engagement plan, scope of services, guest selection criteria, hours of operation, 24-hour contact, and an annual meeting with notice to people in the vicinity and to the city. So with that, we're seeking your direction on this and final discussion about the definitions.
And just one quick update on the definitions. So there was a lot of discussion about should there be one definition, multiple definitions, and then one definition that's an umbrella that cross-references the other ones, and that's what you see here is an overarching umbrella definition, but then also sub-definitions, so we know exactly what other types of shelters are. The one edit I do want to make to this slide is that the shelter, temporary warming and cooling, we intend to strict the hours. It implies it's only at night. We can just say warming and cooling, so it could be day or night, if the commission wants as well.
Okay.
And then, so these definitions should include some of the feedback that we heard from Commissioner McGriff and Commissioner O'Donnell at the follow-up meeting since our last work session. Some other comments that came up out of that meeting was some comments regarding to if they should be permitted in residential zones or not. Can you go back to the slide for the City Commission direction? So this is what we last heard from the commission. Again, shelters always requiring a conditional use, but it would be in MUC and MUD, which is, think of primarily the flat part of the city at the bottom and then up the spine for 7th and Malala. And then in our high density zones and then medium density residential zones up to 10 beds.
And in your packet, there's a compilation and summary of all the public comments received to date, including the most recent comments about shelters in low-density residential zones for conditional uses that exist in those zones.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Well, I'm not shy about this, and I know there's always a danger that when you speak this, there's people that would paint you as an uncompassionate, unfeeling individual. And believe me, that's not the case. But the truth of the matter is, I'll just take one issue at a time. I'm not in favor of any shelters other than in the mixed-use commercial or mixed-use downtown. And I'll say it right out. When a person buys a home, that is the single largest expenditure that they will ever make in their lifetime for most people. And they have an expectation of what they're buying into for a neighborhood. And quite honestly, when the state's passing this thing about putting 5 plexes into single-family residence, I hope when the League of Oregon Cities sues them that we join that suit, because I still feel when you buy a home, you buy an expectation of a lifestyle. And you've paid for it, and you deserve it. And it's not for the state to do otherwise, nor is it for the city. I question whether cooling shelters are necessary. I certainly understand the warming shelters. Cooling shelters, usually that's a daytime event. There's places to go, there's stores, there's public places.
We're surrounded on 2 sides by water.
We keep expanding our needs, and I don't understand why we need cooling shelters. There's times when I didn't have air conditioning. You know where I went? To the mall and walked around. So, I don't know how much we want to expand this. I'm not willing to exclude faith-based or church organizations. And I've just read a thing in today's paper, and read it if you get a chance. It's about good intentions going wrong, and it involves car camping and not really define things where churches say, well, just park your car on my lot. Well, okay, what does that breed? So, I'm not in favor of car camping in any way, shape, or form, and if I can prohibit it in this city, I would. The homeowner suffers some things too. Let's use some common sense approach to this. If I have a home for sale and I'm next to an encampment, and any of these other commissioners has a home for sale and they're not, what's the more desirable property to a buyer? Because I think the homeowner suffers a loss in value, a decrease in livability, and then we have these community losses by encouraging these things. So, as Mr. Shaw said, I'm all for regional solutions. The OC experience is such that we're the ones that are offering the solution. We're the ones that offer it. And I still feel if you build it, they will come. We need to be regional instead of our own offering. So we've got costs incurred, stated and unstated, reported and unreported. And I'll stand by my convictions, especially on, I don't feel I should differentiate that an R2 gets one of these things in their neighborhood because they're only an R2 and an R5 or R8 doesn't. To me, that's discriminatory. That's what they were able to afford for housing. That's what they thought their lifestyle was going to be. I'm not one to change it for them. So I'll start off with that, and I'll stand by my convictions.
So what you're saying is you want to eliminate the R3.5, R2, and R5 zones from being able to have shelters?
Other than the mixed-use commercial and mixed-use downtown, there's no shelters elsewhere in the city.
Okay.
It's a pretty simple statement.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Mr. Lousmith.
So, I can start with that one. I agree that my microphone's not on, sorry. I agree with Commissioner O'Donnell. I'd like to remove the high density and medium density conditional use approval areas. However, I would like to include faith-based institutions, sites that may be within residential zones. However, I think they need to go through the conditional use. I think it has to be a shelter. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, we've defined shelter. We're not tackling car camping, and we're not tackling some of these things. And so to work on this issue that Commissioner O'Donnell kind of poked on a little bit, he's concerned about, a church allowing cars, not to take words out of your mouth if I misconstrue, but so hypothetically, what if a church said, okay, we want to allow, they sign up to be a temporary shelter or something. Are we allowing like car camping and stuff? I mean, I guess I'm assuming that defining a day shelter or a temporary shelter, that there's more substance that comes along with that. You see what I mean? Versus just saying cars.
Right, so if you allow them in churches, churches already require conditional use. So when they start to change the use, like allowing car camping, that would trigger a conditional use regardless of any shelter. It's just because the use changed. For car camping, we only allow, the only place in our code where we allow RVs is like the RV park. It's not a permitted use in any other zoning designation. And Jim, is there a provision against car camping anywhere in our code? Do you know? We do have an RV section.
24 hours on the street.
But yeah, so from the zoning perspective, RVs can only be in the RV park.
So this concern about this hypothetical scenario of RVs or cars camping out in church parking lots, that should be mitigated via the police department or other things.
And the conditional use on the church would get triggered.
Right.
You're saying maybe that they're proposing to, let's say, have 15 parking stalls overnight available as their shelter.
In their parking lot.
And go through the process.
I don't know what they're proposing. I mean, I guess if that's one of their proposal, and the other is that they could have a hall or a room somewhere that they're opening up for cots or something that's a temporary shelter.
If they went through the process, they would have to clarify what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Yes, I mean, it's right.
And so, I mean, I guess theoretically, let's just take that.
Yeah.
Maybe they've come up with such an amazing plan that the planning commission and the city commission are willing to say, we're willing to do this for a year and see how it goes, right? Or no. I think you've got a lot of latitude in that conditional use.
So here's where I'm at on that. I agree with Commissioner Delisle Smith, but I think that the conditional use process goes through the planning commission. And I think that automatically, if the decision is yes, then that automatically comes to the city commission for confirmation.
Yeah, I think we had mentioned that before in a previous one, that for shelters, that we wanted any of those decisions that were reviewed by the planning commission to come to the city commission.
But I agree with Commissioner O'Donnell. I think, whether it's R2 or R10, people have paid to live, whether they're paying rent or whether they're buying a house, they've paid to live, and they went and looked. Now, certainly we have some places, just like every city, where the poorest people get the worst accommodations in apartments or whatever the case may be, but that's the best they can do, and they shouldn't be subjected to a shelter in their community more than anybody else. So I agree with them. I think that shelters definitely have to be a conditional use, have to go through the process, but I would want to verify in the code that if the planning commission says yes, that has to be affirmed by the city commission.
Yep.
I'm done.
Get the thing to work, so.
Okay. I agree with that too, and I like that process as well.
Ms. McGriff?
Yes, thank you. I had a couple of questions. So the staff report talks about this magic number 10. So in MUD and MUC, is that limited to 10 beds as well? Or that's an unlimited number, subject to the conditional use permit? The other thing I was trying to find was there was several conversations about faith-based something in these documents. I couldn't find that anywhere. that we got?
It's not in
Okay, it was, it's in the public comments, okay. I read them all previously. I didn't go back and reread them again for tonight's meeting.
Yeah, they were the newer ones after, so we got them in between or right before your last hearing or kind of at the last hearing, and they were generally requests to allow conditional uses at faith-based organizations in residential zones.
Were any of those comments from the churches themselves? Because all the ones I saw were individual people.
It appeared to be a form letter that different
It was a
people
form letter, but none of them said, I'm the Prince of Life Lutheran Church and I want to do X, Y, or Z. So that I didn't see in any of that.
That's right. I thought they were representing churches.
I didn't see any church's name attached to any of those. The
It
form
wasn't
letter
on
was,
church letterhead, no.
no, they were, I couldn't tell, I mean, not that I'm expecting that, but, I guess maybe Dan, you can help me with this. So we had part of a conversation tonight, and how do we as a local government continue to have a conversation? So for instance, something I heard Brian say, that they've had some successes. So what are they consider success? I don't know. Do people have the right to plop down anywhere they please? Because that seems to be the consensus that I can go anywhere I want. It doesn't matter what the consequences of it are. There's a whole issue of, as I learned when I worked, many of you know I worked downtown, and I was in Old Town Chinatown for 17 years. We had regular meetings with the Clean and Safe program. We had regular meetings with the police department. We had regular meetings with the Downtown Association about what to do, what not to do. I never felt threatened, approached, or had any issues when I worked down there. I'll be very honest about that. I know other people who have, but maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just me. One of the issues we suffered greatly from is people who don't want to, I call it people who don't want to come in from the cold. They want to do whatever they want to do, and it doesn't really matter. That's another part of that conversation. As you said, it's 10% of the people causing 80 to 100% of the problems, and then there's the 80% who are really not causing problems. So I don't know how we, as a governing body, can continue to have some conversation about this without it being just an individual person.
Well, I think the answer to that question is that, how long have you been retired?
Me?
Yeah.
Personally?
Yeah. Or not go? 4 years?
4 or so.
Yeah, so that was really about the beginning of the serious homeless problem in downtown.
I know.
So I can tell you that I went down to do so it was before the last general election, because I was testifying at some public committee thing. And I was in downtown Portland. I parked 2 or 3 blocks away from the building I was going to. And halfway there, this homeless guy comes up to me, or I don't know what he was, but he saw my name tag. Oh, you're the mayor, blah, 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 you're important. I'm going to whoop your butt, blah, blah, blah. And, and I didn't have my weapon on me, and I was concerned. And fortunately, there was one of those Clean and Safe or Portland Patrol people down there, and he got right on the guy and moved him away from me and got me inside the building. So part of the problem is permissiveness, allowing this to continue and to occur. That's why Portland has the problem they have, because they've just said, okay, we're just not going to do anything anymore.
That's very permissive.
Well, and I think part of the reason that if you drive around Oregon City, you don't see it so much because they tend to hide in the woods or someplace else, someplace where you aren't normally, driving by or walking through, with the exception of, Kennywood Park and some other places. I think what we have to do is just put our foot down and say, we're not going to allow camping in public. And even if the 80% of the people don't cause any law enforcement problems, they're still causing environmental problems. They're still causing health problems. Certainly the children that are living in those camps are in horrific conditions. I'm not sure there's a whole lot more we can do, but I definitely am not willing to allow, any church just to go through a conditional use process and have the ability to be a shelter, because they will all do it. And once they do, then the word will get out that there's all these shelter spaces available, and pretty soon, you know, again, Frank is right. I know the homeless advocates say that it's not true, but I believe if you build it, they will come. And I think the Father's Heart is proof of that.
I appreciate your response, because I would agree that there's definitely a network, just like there's other networks, where people will talk and they'll say, go here, it's less permissive, or go here, they're really strict, or whatever. And I have personal experience with that particular conversation.
Yeah, if you let your kid lip off to you, then he's gonna do it more often.
So what I get concerned about is as Jim said, continued escalating costs to livability. There's two sides to the coin. And I know that I have, by invitation, participated early on in some of the Oregon City Coalition. And unfortunately, I did not continue to attend due to the fact that the information that I was asked to provide was not being believed about what was going on in my neighborhood.
Okay,
And you saw the dots, so
we're
you
getting
know.
a little
yeah.
bit off
So no.
topic here.
So yeah, thank you, I appreciate it.
Commissioner Lyle Smith, you got anything to add?
Yes, because I don't think we're quite done with this topic, so I'm trying to get us back to just shelters. So when I'm thinking about fees and process, that was part of the other reason that we wanted all of these different definitions, because at the end of the day, we had several requests to waive the conditional use fee for some uses. And I thought at one time that in some cases that this commission thought that that was okay, but in others, no, they thought they should do the conditional use fee. And so I guess for that piece of it, I mean, otherwise we don't need all of these. That's part of the reason we need all of these different definitions, I thought. Otherwise, we could just lump most of them together. For example, day shelter, I'm not sure why we're calling that one out separately if we don't have a reason to. We kind of have this umbrella definition of shelter. And if everything applies to everything in that category, then I'm not sure why we're calling out day shelter unless we were, which essentially is the Father's Heart. My understanding would be like the Father's Heart is a day shelter. And I thought that we were considering not charging the conditional use fee for day shelters or emergency shelters.
So can you hang on 1 second? Is
Yes.
anybody in favor of not charging the conditional use fee?
I am not in favor of not charging.
Is anybody?
Can you repeat that? Since Frank just gave me a
Is there anybody in favor of waiving the fee for a shelter?
No.
No.
I am,
Okay. Okay, well, you're already outnumbered, so.
clearly. Okay, so I'll move on from that.
Can Frank and I try to answer the question you had about why we recommended additional definitions?
Sure.
When we met with Laura and Tony, I understand that there's the generic definition. However, because these other definitions are in general use around our region, I wanted specifically them in there as a subcategory, because someone could come in and say, well, even though it says it's a shelter, I really mean that I'm a this, that, or I'm a that, or I'm a this. And we wanted to make sure that we had any other possibilities, we had everything covered, because there's always, just when you think you've got your generic definition, sure as shooting, somebody's gonna come in with Plan Z-1 that doesn't fit any of that. So one of the things Laura suggested is that she added, I didn't see it in here, that we have, and any other that might fit in this, so that we wouldn't be getting into a similar use ruling or anything of that sort.
You know that
Sorry. The second to last sentence includes the other temporary or permanent spaces
Right, that was the statement.
made available for sheltering individuals or
Right.
families.
That's sort of the catch-all for anything else that somebody might dream up.
Okay, so beyond the fee, Rachel, what else you have?
Well, I was trying to think of a way so that we didn't have to do emergency declarations every time it dipped below 33 degrees or above 95 degrees to try to streamline our process for temporary warming and cooling shelters. So the only thing that I could come up with was like this pre-approved list that had already been through the conditional use process that we had designated as temporary warming and cooling shelters that could just automatically stand up whenever this situation happened.
But the point is that once you go through the conditional use process, so I don't think Father's Heart has gone through that, have they?
No, they're a day shelter that's just outright permitted right now, because we don't have definitions of.
But under this code, they would be required to go through a conditional use process.
Well, if they wanted to be a warming shelter, they would have to go through it. If they wanted to keep doing what they're already doing, they wouldn't have to.
Okay, so the point is that by putting this in place, then everybody who does it is going to have to go through the conditional use process. Once they've done that, so like the old Oregon City Hospital, whatever they're calling it now, they were using a basement suite there for warming shelters. They could go through the conditional use process one time, and from then on, they could do that warming shelter, and that you wouldn't have to go through, we wouldn't have to do those emergency resolutions. So once Father's Heart and those people did that, then they're covered for until something changes, right?
You have a lot of latitude with the conditional use permit. They're covered forever as long as you allow them to be covered forever. If you don't want them covered forever, then
Right.
you can include that.
You could say 5 years, every 5 years you have to come back, or something like that.
So we essentially no longer need to declare emergencies every time it's.
I think you're gonna have to declare an emergency every time, because I'm gonna be surprised how many nonprofits are gonna come in and go through a conditional use, be it warming or cooling shelter. I think we're gonna be in the exact same position we've been in year after year.
You will definitely see some requests this year because the code hasn't been implemented yet.
But
Certain.
the difference there is, Mr. Manager, is that if we put the process in place like we're talking about, they aren't going to be able to just weasel through the planning commission. They're going to have to come before us.
I don't disagree. I just think that for a nonprofit to come up with a conditional use fee to be a warming shelter when it's 33 degrees, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're all going to come in and go through that process. I'm going to be shocked if they do. I think they're going to come in and say, it's cold. We have an emergency resolution to operate until March. I think that's what's going to happen. I think you're going to have that with churches as well, of which now they're excluded. And so we'll have to deal with that as well.
And I would say, sorry, we have a process that you have to go through, and if you didn't go through it, we're not passing an emergency ordinance just for you.
Okay.
Your knowledge, are institutions like Father's Heart compensated by anyone, government or elsewise, for
Yes.
providing warming shelters?
The county, from my understanding, they get paid for each bed night that they provide
Okay.
to the public.
I still question the need for cooling shelters. I don't understand that. I'm fine with the warming shelters, absolutely fine with it.
Okay.
But cooling shelters kind of pushes the limits of my imagination.
The maximum number of more than 90-degree days in the last 5 years has been 9 in any given year.
So should I take that one off then? Sounds like that's an easy one to.
Yeah, I think.
I would leave it.
I'm okay if it's in there. I don't have a problem with it.
Was that a yes, take it away? Okay.
I'm for taking it away.
I am too.
And then,
Hold on, that's only two.
We have,
I had two
questioning
yeses,
how many-
I had 2 yeses, I had 2 nos.
I'm saying leave it in.
Right, that's what I mean. You were a leave it. I think Rachel was a
Rocky.
leave it.
I don't think it needs to stay in there.
Okay.
so take away
People can get
cooling
used to it
shelter.
pretty fast.
I'm just gonna go through a couple of the things you guys talked about real quick. Making shelters, after they go to the planning commission, come to the city commission. So it's a conditional use plus kind of thing. So
Right.
it's still a conditional use, but it's conditional
It
use.
can be denied at the planning commission level, but it can't be approved without an affirmation from the city commission.
Okay. Is there agreement in everyone for that process?
Yes.
For whatever we decide to say it as a conditional use?
It's kind of like an annexation.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm seeing at least 3 yeses there. And then
Transitional. Do you
the
want to?
definitions, are you guys okay with generally the definitions if we subtract the cooling thing?
Yes.
1, 2.
And I asked for the additional transitional shelters, and I asked because I didn't want people to be permanently in transition. You know, I mean,
You're either in or
and you can read the definition or put it on the screen or whatever you care to do. They have a function, and it is to transition, not to, I spent my maximum allowable 90 days, and then I left for a day and went to Portland, and I came back and I started 90 days all over. I don't want to play that game. I surely want to encourage people to transition.
So that implies, though, that all overnight shelters, are you saying should only be transitional shelters with this time limit?
No, I put transitional shelters for their more long-term stay.
And to be honest, I'm not going to argue with Commissioner O'Donnell because I think that is totally unenforceable. I don't think anybody keeps any records.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any way to confirm it. I'm happy to leave it in, but
No, they know. Aren't they supposed to know who's coming and going?
yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm not disagreeing or agreeing. I'm just saying I think there's a way that can be tracked.
I mean, if we don't have to have ID to vote, do they have to have ID to get into a shelter?
Well, you have to have ID to vote, I thought.
Not anymore.
All right. And so can you go back to your first slide? The last, it seems like the last outstanding thing, because it was no on touching the fees related to shelters. Although Commissioner McGriff still had requested us to come back and look at some fees, so I'll do that separately anyway. The uses, or which zoning designations they should be allowed. It sounded like there was consensus in MUD and MUC, and then it sounded like only in residential zones with a religious institution or no residential zones. Which one of those 2 scenarios were you landing on?
I would say
No residential zones.
No in residential zones?
I thought my compromise there was that they had to go through conditional use and that amplified conditional use process means it has to be approved by the city commission. That way.
Same as everything else.
So it would be okay for a religious institution in any conditional zone?
Nope, I'm not going to
Because
support
they have
that.
the planning commission plus in your scenario.
I'm not going to support that. I'm going to support Commissioner O'Donnell's suggestion.
No, in no residential zones?
That's what I said.
Okay, I'm all right with that.
Okay, so no residential zones, I heard the mayor.
So is it,
O'Donnell.
so are you saying only faith-based organizations?
Nothing.
Saying only MUC and MUD. They are not allowed in any other zone, regardless of the institution.
I'm just trying to figure out what the commission is, I don't know which direction. You have a couple different, it sounded like you have 2 different scenarios. One where it's not allowed in any residential zone, one where it is allowed in a residential zone in conjunction with a faith-based institution.
No?
I think all 4 of them are in the no period.
Okay, so
If
is that correct?
faith-based organizations want to do something like that, let them pool their resources, find a place in MUC, MUD, and set it up.
Okay, so I
So,
think,
yeah, and I support that, given the fact that there's going to be some time between this meeting and the next meeting, and I rather imagine we're going to get some feedback, so we'll see what that feedback is.
okay, I think we have really clear directions. Thank you very much.
And I
any
do
other
know of a
No,
church
that's
right
great.
now that's having a major debate among their congregation
I'm sure.
about whether they, I mean, it's not, there's been some heat going on.
Oh, I don't,
Oh, I'm
I don't
sure.
doubt it.
There's been some good intentions that have gone far astray. And my concern with this car camping, a lot of it comes from this gentleman's article tonight about how do you set that up and how do you monitor it, and do you have the security on site? And if you put out porta potties and you got X number of cars on your lot, what about the people that park on the adjoining street to use those facilities? So it's
Well-
good intentions going astray.
And I've seen plans from a couple of different churches to build these like Conestoga shack things that are on wheels so they can roll them out and roll them back in and that kind of thing. So, you know, again, I think we cannot allow ourselves to be so permissive that we let this problem continue to happen. Are you clear on everything now?
Crystal, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then we're adjourned.